For centuries, the Roman Empire appeared invincible. Civilization so vast, organized, and technologically advanced that many of its own citizens believed it would last forever. Yet the real reasons for Rome's fall were not sudden invasions, or a single catastrophic event, but a slow internal decay hidden beneath the illusion of strength. At its height in the 2nd century CE, under emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, Rome controlled territories stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, supported by an unmatched road network. Disciplined legions, centralized law, and a complex administrative, a system that bound diverse cultures together under Roman authority. However, this immense scale was also Rome's greatest weakness. As governing such a vast empire required enormous resources, constant military readiness, and a stable political system, conditions that gradually collapsed under their own weight, political power in Rome became increasingly unstable after the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, ending the Pax Romana and initiating a period where emperors rose and fell through violence, bribery, and military coups rather than merit or legitimacy. The Senate lost real authority, emperors ruled through fear, and loyalty shifted from the state to individual generals, eroding unity from within. Economically, Rome began to suffer severe inflation as emperors debased currency to pay soldiers and fund wars, reducing silver content in coins until trust in money collapsed, trade weakened, and prices soared. Heavy taxation crushed farmers and small landowners, forcing many into debt or abandonment of land, while wealthy elites hoarded resources and avoided taxes through corruption. Militarily, Rome expanded beyond sustainable limits, requiring massive armies to guard borders that stretched thousands of kilometers. While recruitment declined as citizens avoided service in the state, increasingly relied on mercenaries whose loyalty depended on payment rather than allegiance. Meanwhile, internal social cohesion weakened as inequality deepened, civic duty declined, and traditional Roman values of discipline and service eroded under decades of instability. Rome did not fall because barbarians were stronger. It fell because its internal systems, political, economic, military, social, were already fractured long before external pressures exposed their weakness. The collapse of Rome was not the sudden death of a civilization, but the slow unraveling of an empire that could no longer sustain the very structures that once made it powerful. After the illusion of Roman permanence began to fracture, the most destructive force accelerating the empire's decline was not an external enemy, but the complete breakdown of political stability and legitimate leadership, which turned Rome inward against itself. Following the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, Rome entered an era where imperial succession ceased to be orderly and became a violent contest, decided by armies rather than law, plunging the empire into recurring cycles of civil war. Were increasingly appointed, overthrown, and assassinated by their own troops, with some reigning only months before being killed, creating a climate where loyalty was transactional and governance impossible. During the 3rd century crisis 235–284 CE, Rome saw more than 20 emperors rise and fall in less than 50 years, many of whom never set foot in Rome itself, ruling instead from military camps while fighting rivals across fractured provinces. This constant instability paralyzed administration, disrupted trade routes, and forced cities and provinces to fend for themselves as central authority evaporated. Political corruption became systemic rather than exceptional, with offices sold for profit, tax collection abused for personal gain, and provincial governors acting as independent rulers. The Senate, once a cornerstone of Roman governance, was reduced to a ceremonial body with no real power, while emperors ruled through fear, purges, and military coercion. As civil wars drained manpower and resources, Rome's economy deteriorated, further forcing emperors to raise taxes and debase currency even more aggressively, deepening public resentment and social fragmentation. The division of the empire, first informally and permanently into eastern and western halves, was a desperate administrative response to chaos. But it also weakened unity and accelerated regional separation, especially as the Western Empire lacked the wealth and stability of the East, Ordinary citizens lost faith in imperial institutions. Civic identity eroded, and survival replaced loyalty as the primary concern. By the time external threats intensified, Rome was already exhausted by generations of internal conflict, its political system hollowed out, its leadership discredited, and its empire held together more by habit than by authority. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire's economic foundations, once a pillar of its power, were crumbling under a combination of overspending, currency devaluation, labor shortages, and social inequality, which together created conditions from which the Western Empire could never fully recover. Rome's military obligations had grown exponentially to defend its enormous borders from Germanic tribes, Sassanid Persians, and internal usurpers, requiring constant expenditures on soldiers, pay fortifications, and supplies, which outpaced tax revenues. To meet these demands, emperors repeatedly debased coinage, reducing silver content in denarii and later creating new currencies with minimal precious metal value. The resulting inflation made everyday trade increasingly unstable and undermined public trust in money, as prices for grain, oil, and other staples soared beyond the reach of most citizens. Agricultural productivity declined as small farmers, burdened by heavy taxation and debt, abandoned their lands or were absorbed into large estates controlled by elites, forcing reliance on tenant labor or imported food. Slavery, once a stabilizing source of cheap labor, had plateaued as Rome's expansion slowed, leaving a labor gap that further strained production. Trade networks, both Mediterranean and overland, suffered from piracy, civil war, and breakdowns in infrastructure, reducing the flow of essential goods and luxury items that had once underwritten the empire's wealth. Economic inequality widened drastically. Wealthy landowners amassed estates exempt from taxes, while the majority of free citizens struggled to survive under heavy fiscal pressure, eroding social cohesion and civic engagement. The empire's western provinces, lacking the wealth of the eastern territories, were hit hardest, leaving armies underpaid, cities underfed, and borders vulnerable. This economic fragility amplified every other weakness: political instability, military inefficiency, and social unrest, so that when external pressures mounted, the Western Empire could not muster the resources or resilience to resist invasions or internal collapse. Ultimately, the economic decay of Rome was both a symptom and a driver of its decline, revealing that an empire's greatness is inseparable from the health of its economy, social equity, and the trust of its citizens. As Rome's political instability and economic decay worsened, the empire's military, once its ultimate shield, became a critical vulnerability, leaving borders increasingly susceptible to pressure from migrating tribes and opportunistic invaders, which ultimately accelerated the Western Empire's fall. Overextended and underfunded, Roman legions were spread across thousands of kilometers of frontier, from the Rhine and Danube in the north to the deserts of North Africa in the south, and could not respond quickly to concentrated attacks. Recruitment problems compounded the issue, as fewer citizens were willing or able to serve, forcing Rome to rely heavily on foederati mercenary barbarian troops whose loyalty was conditional on payment, land grants, or personal allegiance to generals rather than the state. Discipline declined, units became fragmented, and leadership often lacked experience or competence, as civil wars diverted seasoned commanders to internal conflicts rather than border defense. Meanwhile, migrations and invasions by Germanic tribes such as the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and later the Huns placed relentless pressure on frontier regions, forcing defensive lines to stretch thinner and allowing incursions into previously secure provinces. The sack of Rome in 410 CE by the Visigoths, followed by repeated incursions into Gaul, Spain, and North Africa, highlighted that even the city itself was no longer untouchable, a stark contrast to its historical reputation of impregnability. Simultaneously, logistical breakdowns in supply lines, deteriorating roads, and insecure ports hindered troop movement and reinforcements, further weakening Rome's ability to project military power. The Eastern Empire, wealthier and more politically stable, could sustain its legions and fortifications. But the West lacked sufficient resources, leaving its armies outnumbered and overstretched. Rome's military decline was not the result of a single catastrophic battle, but the cumulative effect of internal decay, insufficient manpower, reliance on mercenaries, and relentless external pressures, demonstrating that the empire fell not because it was conquered in a conventional sense, but because it could no longer maintain the defenses, cohesion, and authority required to survive in a hostile and dynamic world.
By the late 5th century CE, the Western Roman Empire had become a shadow of its former glory. Its institutions fractured, its economy collapsed, its military overstretched and demoralized, and its social fabric torn by inequality and internal conflict, leaving it incapable of withstanding the final waves of external pressure, culminating in 476 CE when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, marking the conventional end of Western imperial authority. Yet this collapse was less an abrupt catastrophe than the culmination of centuries of compounding weaknesses, political instability, economic mismanagement, military decline, social fragmentation, and reliance on mercenary forces that eroded Rome from within long before invaders breached its walls. The fall of Rome also reveals profound lessons for understanding the fragility of complex civilizations. Empires depend not only on military might or territorial expansion, but on the resilience of political institutions, economic stability, social cohesion, and cultural identity. When any of these pillars erode over time, even the most seemingly invincible state becomes vulnerable to pressures both internal and external. While the Western Empire disintegrated, the Eastern Empire, known as Byzantium, survived for nearly 1,000 more years by maintaining economic resources, administrative efficiency, and military discipline, illustrating that longevity depends on adaptability as much as strength. Rome's legacy persists not in its territorial control, but in law, architecture, language, engineering, and governance models that shaped Europe for millennia. The Roman legal system, roads, aqueducts, and urban planning informed medieval and modern civilizations, while the notion of empire itself became a benchmark for power, ambition, and governance. Ultimately, the story of Rome's fall demonstrates that no empire, regardless of size or splendor, is immune to decay, and that the maintenance of complex systems, political, social, economic, and military is essential for survival, serving as both a historical warning and a framework for understanding the rise and fall of civilizations across time.